Okay, the people are like, nah, still icy out.
So, but we're actually, the Zoom is working because
Yes.
half the time it
Yeah.
takes 15
So far, I've
seconds.
got everything working correctly. I even know how to change slides.
Oh, you were so good.
I'm lucky.
Well, I'm Joyce Coleman. I'm a retired professor of English Lit from OU. And I have the honor today of introducing Nathan Dougherty. Can't say his name, but there he is. And Dr. Dougherty is an assistant professor of musicology at the University of Oklahoma, where he teaches graduate courses in music history and directs OU's Collegium Musicum. He received his PhD in historical musicology from Case Western Reserve University in 2022, and he holds degrees in early music performance from the University of Southern California and in vocal performance from St. Olaf College in Minnesota. Nathan specializes in 18th and 19th century French song and song cultures, with broader interests in historical performance practices, gender studies, historiography, and the medical humanities. He also maintains an active career as a tenor and haute contre, which I don't know what that is.
It's just a French word for a slightly higher tenor.
Okay. He has sung with many of the nation's leading early music ensembles. So we're going to have the pleasure today as well of hearing not only from Nathan, but also from his colleague, Carey Morrow, who is a performer and teacher of guitar and early music at Southwestern Oklahoma State University. There we are.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting us to speak and to perform today. I'm really looking forward to kind of nudging this in a direction I don't think this lecture series goes very often, which is quite a bit further forward in time, looking at medievalisms instead of, well, the Middle Ages. Particularly looking at musical depictions of Agnès Sorel and the 100 Years' War in France. And again, I'm also thrilled to welcome my friend Carey Morrow so that we can perform several of the songs that I'll talk about along the way. So I would like to start with a passage from Albert Claire's 1841 Physiology of a Musician, a satirical work that summarizes 19th century anxieties about women and music. Quote, "Music neuters, so to speak, Article 213 of the Civil Code, and guarantees the independence of a virtuoso from the power of her husband. Madame makes music is an argument that responds to all objections, all marital pretensions. Omnipotence is no longer with the beard, but with the cavatina. What could one say about attention to housework, children, the hemming of neckties, etc.? Madame makes music. The husband has no right to take fright when he hears her through the conjugal keyhole, a feminine voice and a young manly voice passionately warbling phrases such as, 'To you my heart, to you my life, both of us, far from a jealous master, love each other.' Well, Madame makes music. Finally, all types of marital protest are strictly forbidden. They could perhaps damage that superb D that earns her the applause of all the dilettantes. Madame makes music. Ah, believe me, do not marry a high D." So Claire claims that music allowed women to circumvent the 1804 Napoleonic Civil Code, or collection of laws, which established paternal authority by, among other things, legally treating married women as minors, incapable of serving as legal witnesses, of seeking paternity suits, or of obtaining custody of their children in the case of divorce. Pointing specifically to Article 213, quote, "The wife must obey her husband," Claire asserts that music allowed women to flip the patriarchal power structure on its head. Moreover, he comments that music led to unseemly vanity and a dereliction of domestic duty. Such complaints were echoed in writings on girls' education extending back to the turn of the 19th century at least. Albertine Adrien Necker de Saussure cautions that, quote, "All success is dangerous in proportion to the intoxication that it causes. And what brilliant success does not intoxicate a bit? In the Beaux-Arts especially, where success receives an immediate reward, where the tumult of applause adds to the exaltation of the talent, it is too much for a young head." Jean-Louise Henriette Genet-Campon advises that artistic talents only acquire an incontestable value when a young woman possesses them without pride, without sacrificing any duty. Consider them an ornament added to more essential qualities and view them as nothing but a means to spread some charm to private life. Focusing on easier and decidedly domestic repertoires, like the Romance, which will be the focus of this talk, mitigated this risk by taking up less time and attention. So the Romance, for those of you who don't know, was the preeminent French song genre in early 19th century France. And kind of their version of a popular love ballad, you might think, very melody forward. Characterized by its simplicity, sweet, natural, rustic melodies, and amorous themes, the genre pervaded the French musical scene, appearing in operas, public concerts, and especially aristocratic and bourgeois salons. In many ways, the Romance was the musical symbol of French identity, quote, an essential form of the French national spirit, according to critic Paul Sudeau. And yet, Claire points to common fears that the Romance also encouraged sexual licentiousness. In the passage I read, the wife shares protestations of love with her duet partner by singing a romance behind closed doors. And Claire, actually, right after that, includes this illustration of some naughty acts happening to highlight the immoral kind of potential of music. Even in instances of no physical impropriety, there was a reputational risk associated with singing romances. So I have here this is a very common theme in 19th century images of young girls being seduced by music masters. So here we have La Leçon is what this is called. You can see the instructor has stolen a kiss while the person who's supposed to be supervising is distracted by a score. In any case, there could also be a reputational risk with singing romances kind of more broadly. In 1837, Sophie Gay complained that young girls believe that by lifting their eyes to the ceiling and pronouncing the word baiser, or to kiss, as if it had 4 B's, they have reached the height of drama. Is it not unseemly to hear these erotic moans coming from virginal voices? What Gay finds distasteful is not the act of young girls singing romances, but singing the wrong kind of romance, and in a way that heightened its distasteful eroticism. In response to such criticism, there was an effort to sanitize this song genre. Publishers, for example, began to indicate which of their romances were appropriate for younger girls. I've highlighted here this little P, which basically just means that it's appropriate for boarding schools. Stéphanie Félicité de Genlis made a case for the genre's utility in her collection of educational romances that she published in 1801. She claimed that she remembered many romances from her youth, but none had words worth remembering. Quote, it would be worth much more to have a sequence of interesting historical events and moral remarks than to have around 2,000 lines of bad poetry that uselessly and dangerously occupy space in memory. Genlis's idea of pedagogical romances, particularly those with a historical focus, gained traction. The anonymous author of the 1834 article La Romance historique, the Romance historique, or the historical romance, argued that the genre was, quote, initially historical, and it is to this national destination that we wish to return it. To do so gives it back its importance, its utility. In effect, by harvesting from the vast fields of our history, the romance will become instructive. Romance is drawing subjects from French history transformed into educational and moral tools. Put into a broader context outlined by scholars like Robert Gadea, Barbara G. Keller, among many others, such romances were part of a broader historical, literary, and musical project to construct post-revolutionary collective memories, to commemorate the medieval past in order to shape the political, social, and national identities of modern performers and listeners. Isabelle Divana summarizes why the French sought to capitalize on a unified and carefully curated vision of the medieval past. Quote, they sought to use history in order to explain the explosive transformations of the revolution and the political chaos that ensued, and to prevent it from happening again. In that sense, the Middle Ages became a sacred haven, a simpler time in the inception and development of the French state. Philippe Martel adds that with the collapse of the Ancien Régime, that is the old monarchy, the French looked to the medieval era to generate a new stock of historical references, and so create a, quote, national consensus. After the historical rupture of the Revolution, it became important to stress French cultural continuity from the Middle Ages, a cultural continuity from the Middle Ages to the present, as a way to project the unity, national identity, and enduring national greatness needed to heal the revolutionary wound. So, getting back to our girls, addressing headmistresses of girls' boarding schools, the author of that article on historical romances recommended, in particular, Guillaume Louis Wilhelm's popular romance, Charles VII to Agnès Sorel, first published in 1814. The song centers on the extramarital affair between Agnès Sorel and Charles VII that began during the 100 Years' War, when England occupied much of France. For some reason, oh, okay. Well, apparently hitting forward no longer works on my slideshow, so this is... All right, fun. Okay, sorry. So, the song itself centers on the extramarital affair between Agnès Sorel and Charles VII that began during the 100 Years' War, when England occupied much of France. As the 19th century version of the story goes, Agnès encouraged the king to abandon his life of idle pleasures in order to drive the English out, thereby restoring both his throne and the nation. But this was far from the only romance about Agnès Sorel. She featured in at least 5 songs during the Restoration alone, and we'll talk a little bit about 19th century French regimes in a bit, making her one of the more popular named historical women in the genre. Given the widespread concerns over sexual immorality outlined above, Agnès, an oft eroticized king's mistress, seems to be a bizarre choice for a role model. And yet, I argue that she became an important symbolic figure for 2 key reasons. First, her narrative mirrored current events, making it an ideal historical analog for the Bourbon Restoration, the regime that came into power after Napoleon's fall. The positive outcomes of that narrative, a newly powerful and glorious France and monarchy, articulated a hopeful vision of the future under the Bourbon regime. Second, her story reinforced emerging theories about proper female decorum, supporting the idea developed by Rousseau and codified in Napoleon's civil code that women were the moral sex, and that their influence over men, when appropriately confined to the home, could regenerate society. To support these claims, in this talk, I will analyze and then perform 3 Restoration romances. But to start, oh, it works again, okay. To start, I would like to share a little bit about the real Agnès Sorel. Many of you in here, of course, work with very fragmentary and contradictory sources. So we actually know very little about her life because, well, there just isn't much from the time about her. But we do have been able to piece together a little bit, especially Tracy Adams. So she was likely born around 1425 in Picardy, and she became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Marie d'Anjou in 1444, so around 19 years old, near the end of the 100 Years' War. And again, I think most of you are aware of the 100 Years' War, but in case you're not, it began in the 14th century, lasted into the middle of the 15th century, an on and off again war between England and France. As this story goes, France is at a real low point. England occupies much of the northern part of the country, including Paris, although by 1444 they've taken it back. The 19th century gets it wrong a lot. So this whole thing is about conflict between England and France. Anyway, so Agnès Sorel goes to court in 1444 and very quickly catches the eye of King Charles VII. And they began an affair that resulted in 3 daughters. She died only 5 years later after traveling to Normandy to warn the king about a plot against his life. And chroniclers at the time suspected poison, an idea that was actually supported by a 2005 study of her remains, which suggests he died of an acute overdose of mercury. In any case, 15th century accounts, those that we have, often focus on her bad influence on courtly morals and fashion. One, for instance, noted that she, quote, oh, no, that's not the right one, all right, that she wore trains a third longer than any princess of the realm, headdresses higher by half, costlier dresses, all of this encouraging the debauchery and dissolution that she produced and initiated. She left her shoulders bare, and in front, her breasts. She promoted lasciviousness amongst men and women. Agnès' reputation, however, really turned around in the 16th century, when a new story about her saving the realm emerged, transforming her into a gentle beauty whose only purpose was to motivate Charles VII's valor. This is best seen in an account of the royal historian Bernard de Girard in his General History of the Kings of France, published in 1576. And the story begins with an indolent Charles VII, unable to tear himself away from his mistress. But Agnès is not happy with the state of affairs and decides to act. And she, quote, told him that when she was a girl, an astrologer predicted that she would be loved by one of the most courageous and valorous kings in Christendom. She thought that Charles was that valorous and courageous king predicted to her by the astrologer, but seeing him so weak and with so little concern for his affairs or for resisting the English, and their King Henry, who was taking so many cities right out from under his nose, while she saw that she had been fooled, and that the valorous and courageous king was in fact the King of England, she said to King Charles, I'm going to find him, because the astrologer meant him, not you, who has neither courage nor valor, since without resisting, you let your kingdom be overcome. This talk, coming from the mouth of this woman whom the king loved, moved his heart so much that he began to cry, and from that moment forward made a great effort, no longer hunting nor lingering in gardens as he had done before, so that he chased the English from France. And this is really the account that moved forward in history. This is exactly the story that 19th century historians, poets, and composers latched onto when commemorating her in histories and in song. So before getting into specific songs, I would like to briefly explore the role of music in girls' education. Because in a general sense, educators in the 19th century sought to prepare girls for their roles as mothers and wives. And theories and practices of music reinforced this mission. Rousseau, for instance, counseled that the entirety of women's education must be relative to men, to please them, to be useful to them, to make them love and honor them, to raise them when young, to care for them when grown, to counsel them, to console them, to make their lives pleasant and sweet. Voila the eternal duties of women and what one must teach them in childhood. Music was considered an ornamental art, alongside drawing and needlework, and many of music's perceived benefits related to men and children. A pedagogue named Buffon, for instance, writes that scenes of a mother performing to calm an anxious child or husband were, quote, the most graceful symbols of domestic union. Music also benefited the woman performer, as many believed that, well, music possessed moralizing qualities. For another pedagogue, Gamp, music represented, quote, a powerful means in education to influence the heart, to soften the character, and to fortify religious sentiment. From a practical standpoint, as discussed, music also helped information stick in a girl's memory. And so for many writers, the primary aim of educational and historical romances was one of behavioral modeling and identity construction through a catchy melodic medium that was all but impossible to forget. So Jean Lise's 1801 collection of educational romances demonstrates the kinds of messages targeted to girls. And the first actually deals with Bathilde de Chelles, who lived from around 626 to 680. She was the queen of Neustria and Burgundy. And her relationship, and the song deals with that and her relationship with Clovis II. So the first strophe establishes Bathilde's feminine morality, drawing attention to her righteous spirit, pure soul, artistic talents, beauty, and grace. Jean then shows that such feminine values could correct men's behavior. In the romance, Bathilde first meets Clovis II as a slave and rebuffs his sexual advances, telling him that a legitimate sovereign protects virtues. And seeing the error of his ways, the king vows to be better. Quote, I can offer you a crown, but you will do much more for me. You will make me worthy of the throne. Your husband must be a good king, and through you, the most beautiful virtue will find more imitators. Your example will make them faithful. Proper behavior depends on queens. Importantly, Jean indicates that Bathilde's morality not only fixed Clovis, but actually kind of regenerated the nation by creating more imitators of this moral kind of worldview. Bathilde was, however, a problematic role model because she served as a regent following her husband's death, meaning she ruled in her own right, and was thus active in a kind of masculine public sphere. And Jean had to do quite a bit to justify Bathilde's reign and her suitability as a role model. First, she presents her, well, as a good ruler who only came to power through virtue. Second, When opposed by male rebels, Genlis writes that Bathilde willingly abdicated, quote, preferring peace to the throne. And finally, Genlis portrays Bathilde as an analogue for the revolutionary era woman who was being called to retreat back to the home after the fighting was done. Quote, the queen in the depths of a monastery learned from experience that on earth there is but one lasting happiness, that of consecrating her life to retirement, to sweet repose, after having accomplished useful work for the country. And it should not be seen as a coincidence that Genlis lauds Bathilde's decision to retire into religious seclusion at exactly the same time that Napoleon's civil code legally cemented distinct feminine private and masculine public spheres. And indeed, in the following decades, Bathilde's regency was actually erased from her historical narrative in works published for girls' education. So they got rid of the entire ruling bit of it. In any case, in the decades after Genlis's 1801 collection, Agnès Sorel emerged as a figure who could convey similar moral themes without the baggage of public sphere transgression. Wilhelm's romance Charles VII to Agnès Sorel presents the narrative from Charles VII's perspective. The text was written in 1814, just as Napoleon's empire collapsed, and it very much celebrates the Bourbon Restoration. And just to orient us in history, in case it's been a while since you've had your 19th century French history, they went through a lot of regime changes after the revolution. You can kind of follow it here, but this does a good job of outlining, in 1789 we have the revolution. In 1804, Napoleon establishes the First Empire, which lasts until 1814, and then briefly comes back for 100 days in 1815. We then get the Restoration, so they bring the old Bourbon family back to rule again, until another revolution in 1830 kicks them out of power, and we get the July monarchy, which is just a different branch of the Bourbon family. That lasts until 1848, when revolutions sweep across Europe again. We have a couple of different regimes for a while, but we eventually get Napoleon III coming back to power, getting the Second French Empire going, which takes us to 1870 at least, and we'll stop there. So we're focused on this, what they call the Second Restoration, which is, again, Louis XVIII comes back into power, basically. So this song was written right at this turning point between the First Empire and the Restoration. Yes, let me see. The song itself begins when Charles VII prepares to retake France at Agnès' insistence. The first stanza lays out the stakes of the romance. Oh, would you like a picture of that image?
Oh, it's okay.
Okay. The first stanza lays out the stakes of the romance. Quote, I will fight, Agnès commands it. Goodbye rest, goodbye pleasures. To avenge my crown, I will have heroes, love, and God. Englishmen, may the name of my beloved bring terror to your ranks. Agnès' influence causes Charles VII to abandon the distracting pleasures of his court. And the consequences of those distractions are made clear in the second strophe. Made clear in the second strophe, when Charles VII admits that by cultivating an idle court, he left France vulnerable, quote, to the swords of foreigners. For listeners in 1814 and 15, the link between the past as presented in the Romance and the present would have been apparent. As in the 100 Years' War, Napoleon's losses allowed English soldiers to occupy Paris. In Charles VII, one can easily see a metaphor for the Bourbon family. His initial hedonism might well be compared to Louis XVI and the decadent court of the Ancien Régime before the Revolution. Charles VII's newfound honor and concern for the glory of France can then be mapped onto Louis XVIII and a newly reinvigorated Bourbon regime. And the Romance itself positions three praiseworthy medieval institutions, heroes or chivalry, love or gallantry, and God or the church, as necessary elements in the effort to renew that monarchy, and unambiguously labels the occupying English as antagonists. In fact, the Romance suggests that the memory of Agnès and the military victories that she supposedly inspired should still frighten the English. Just as a strengthened Charles VII drove the English out of France in the 15th century, the restored Bourbons exhibiting the medieval values that Agnès encouraged, would do the same. 19th century writers noted the success of Agnès' allegorical role at this time. Writing about this very song, Charles VII to Agnès Sorel in 1860, Baptiste Capfigue asserted that, quote, the name of Agnès Sorel served as a standard to rouse the people against foreign domination. And when in 1814, the perils of France called for the awakening of the nation, the sweet name of Agnès Sorel came to mix with the songs of the king's military banner. Wilhelm's music serves two purposes. It evokes an idealized militant medieval soundscape and bolsters Agnès' position as the song's active agent, as the catalyst for much needed change. And I apologize here, we're gonna get into a tiny bit of music theory, so you just hold on, I'll try and at least make conclusions that are, logical. In any case, the duple meter, meaning counted in two, the dotted rhythms, and the horn call like leaping fourths recall a march and suggest military conflict, while its medieval setting is evoked by a drone on E, basically meaning a long held note in the bass, which is really common in medievalism in the 19th century. The song itself begins in a sad A minor, modulating to the relative C major in the second phrase, but it's the third phrase that's really important. I'll draw our attention here. The third phrase rests almost entirely on what we call the dominant, or the fifth scale degree. This is a really tense harmony that strongly seeks resolution back to the tonic, or the main key. And he doesn't give us this resolution until the refrain. But this time it comes in an A major instead of A minor, when Charles VII regains his honor. In each strophe, that extended dominance in the third phrase begins melodically on the word belle, or the phrase ma belle, my beauty or my beloved. And the musical message of this is rather clear. Agnès forcefully demands resolution and pushes Charles VII, and by extension France, from the unfortunate world of A minor into the victorious world of A major. Even if Charles VII is the singing subject, Agnès is the real protagonist. The rest of the romance positions gallantry as a vital source of national strength. As 18th century antiquarian Jean-Baptiste de la Serre de Saint-Palais asserted, quote, no obstacle can stop Frenchmen when they act to serve and please women, which I think is an idea we still have floating around. Capfigue claimed that, quote, the French nation has always distinguished itself with sweet and polite behavior. To the masculine and glorious character that makes them sprint to the battlefields, it adds a perfect gallantry. He claims that such respect and love of women was a unique legacy of the Middle Ages, entirely unknown in ancient Greece or Rome. In other words, it was wholly French. Charles VII to Agnès Sorel, the song, bolsters this conception of gallantry. Charles VII announces that, quote, a single word from Agnès shamed him into action, and that he would be victorious for love. The refrain theorizes gallantry as a double-edged sword. Near her I forget honor, Agnès restores all honor to me. Here, women are both the cause of and solution to the problem, able to lead men astray as well as inspire them to greatness. All right, so I'm going to invite Carey up now to share 3 strophes of this piece. Score. He actually is playing on a guitar from the 19th century, so it's quite a bit smaller than the classical guitar you might be used to seeing. It's a parlor guitar. I'm sure he would be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. All right, let's give this a whirl. Je vais combattre Agnès Bourdonne, adieu repos, plaisir, adieu. J'aurai pour manger ma couronne, tes errants, l'amour et mon belle, dans vos rangs porte la terreur. J'oubliais l'honneur au prêteur, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. J'oubliais l'honneur au prêteur, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. Dans les jeux d'une courroisive, français et loin, loin des dangers, je laissais la France captive, après en faire des étrangers. Un mot, un seul mot de ma belle, a couvert mon front de rougeur. J'oubliais l'honneur auprès d'elle, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. J'oubliais l'honneur auprès d'elle, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. Du noir à Trimoille, à Fatraille, aux Français, quel jour enchanté, comme des lauriers devant bataille, je couronnerai la beauté. Français, nous devrons à ma belle, la gloire et vous le bonheur. J'oubliais l'honneur auprès d'elle, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. J'oubliais l'honneur auprès d'elle, Agnès me rend tout à l'honneur. Yeah, it's really catchy. A nice song. You can see why this kind of stuck around in the popular imagination for a while. So the next song I want to look at was written at right around the same time. Pierre d'Alvimar's Agnès Sorel to Charles VII, composed in 1812, presents the story from Agnès' point of view, showing how virtuous women could inspire men to gallant deeds, or how a woman might model morality at home to improve a man's behavior. Here, Agnès sings to rouse Charles VII to action by directly appealing to his gallant nature. She claims that his love for her requires him to avenge the, quote, double affronts of Crécy and Poitiers, two disastrous 14th century battles. As he plans to flee, she reminds him that his motto is honor and valor. And she then references the astrologer who foretold that she would love a great king, promising to be his beloved only if he returns victorious. Underscoring Agnès' feminine voice, the music itself is far less militant than previous romance. d'Alvimar replaces the duple meter and dotted figures with a lilting dance-like triple meter and a far more graceful melody, and never truly modulates. We don't change key in the one you're about to hear. When she sings, Agnès is an unchanging domestic presence, whose sole focus is inspiring Charles VII to glory. Written just before the Restoration, when Napoleon was still in power, royalist themes in d'Alvimar's Agnès Sorel to Charles VII are subdued. Charles VII is never mentioned by name and is depicted in a much harsher light. In the third strophe, for instance, Agnès sarcastically hails him as, quote, the hero of our France, when he desires to flee combat. The song does not establish whether or not he rose to the occasion. The final strophe merely indicates that Agnès hopes that history will remember that she, quote, loved him, guided him to glory, and restored him to honor and to the French. And yet, there are hints at royalist leanings, particularly at the end of the first strophe, when Agnès calls for a revival of the radiance of the French lily, an unmistakable reference to the Bourbon dynasty. And I'm sure all of you know this, but this is, the heraldic mark of the Bourbon family. So referencing a lily in any way kind of immediately calls them to mind in France. So while Dalleviomar was actually wrapped up in the imperial court, he was the harpmaster for Empress Josephine. He had earlier served as a bodyguard for Louis XVI, and he had been inscribed on a list of émigrés during the Revolution. That is the list of people who had to flee France for fear that they would lose their heads. He also retired from the imperial court in 1812, right at the same time that he was writing this song. So there may be something there. In any case, once more, I would like to invite Carey to join me as we sing this romance, now from the perspective of Agnès. Sorry, let me get this score up now.
Soir des creux et fleurs de courtoisie, gentil dauphin, amour de ton Agnès, au nom d'amour te requiert et te prie, viens relever l'éclat du lys français. Viens relever l'éclat du lys français. Quantifier, héros de notre France, ô vos courage, un indigne repos. Votre devise est honneur et véhéance, effacez-la, déchirez vos drapeaux. Effacez-la, déchirez vos drapeaux. Je veux un jour que la fidèle histoire dise en mêlant mon nom à tes offres. Agnès l'aima, lui concède la gloire et le rendit à l'honneur aux Français. Elle le rendit à l'honneur aux Français.
One of these really lovely melodies. I will actually say, this is a genre that's really not performed very much anymore. It's often cast as a bit trite, and certainly wrapped up in gendered politics, and has been for a long time. It's seen as rather feminine. So it's been largely dismissed. But I think there's really something here. I'm rather drawn to these pieces. In any case, pull back up my script. Okay. So, Agnès was, in many ways, an ideal historical heroine for Restoration-era romances. Practically speaking, her story involves romantic love, and thus it fits far more snugly into typical amorous romance subject matter than someone like, I'll say, Joan of Arc, the Virgin Maid of Orleans. And yet there is a deeper significance tied to the story of Agnès, one that is steeped in gender politics. In an article entitled Les Femmes, or Women, in 1834, Ernest Falconet claims that women who transgress the natural order, who act in the public sphere, so people like Queen Elizabeth I, who had Mary Stuart killed, or Catherine de' Medici, who supposedly planned the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, well, these women inevitably become cruel, violent, and sexually licentious. And he juxtaposes such crimes with Agnès Sorel. Quote, "If by a striking but true contrast, I showed you the influence of women on the heart of man, if my indiscreet mouth spoke of the sweet moments when the holiest thoughts are born, the most virtuous resolutions, kisses from Agnès Sorel that saved France, the joys of love inspiring both happiness and courage, perhaps you would be willing to agree with me that women are not destined to act, but to love. In essence, by adhering to accepted gender roles, by remaining within the home, Agnès was a far less threatening figure than someone like Joan of Arc, and represented a more appropriate model for women singing romances. Agnès' greatest deed, according to Falconet, was to inspire Charles VII to act. She did not take up arms herself, she was the object of his gallant love, pushing him to glory. In this way, Agnès exemplified ideas concerning the moralizing power of domestic women. Historian James Macmillan has shown that by 1814, French society had largely accepted that women ought to be relegated to the home, where they could safely exercise influence over their husbands and sons. Campan framed this as a patriotic duty. She wrote, quote, "A truly national sentiment must make women regard their homes as the sole theater of their glory, and soon public morality will demonstrate the immense strides that social order has made towards a better order of things." The romances I've discussed so far all seek to prove the validity of this philosophy, especially Wilhelm's Charles VII to Agnès Sorel, the first song. Not only does Agnès' virtue positively influence Charles VII, the final strophe states that France as a whole owes its prosperity to her. Her morality in the home, in other words, not only restored the monarchy, but the nation. Moreover, the very fact that Charles VII stands as the public-facing singing character, even as Wilhelm argues that Agnès was important, well, it places Agnès in a kind of musical and textual private sphere as well. She's kind of hidden behind the public face of Charles VII. Myriad 19th century sources indicate that Agnès was a model of femininity that could and should be folded into girls' education. Pierre Blanchard, for instance, included her in his Beauties and the History of France, a volume that brought together a number of women from French history as role models and kind of sought to, quote, elevate the soul of adolescents and inspire in them zeal for the honor of the French name. Such sources also tend to ascribe a series of feminine virtues to Agnès. In the introduction to his 1824 book on Agnès Sorel, for instance, Quatremère de Roissy writes that she was compassionate, charitable, and pious. Friedrich Schiller, playing with the historical timeline quite a bit, casts Agnès Sorel as the feminine foil for the masculine Joan of Arc. In his 1801 play, Die Jungfrau von Orleans, or the Maid from Orleans, a wildly successful play that was often emulated in France over the following decades. He presents Joan as a tragic, conflicted heroine whose cruelty is linked to her renunciation of the norms of her sex. Her Act 4 soliloquy, in which she painfully realizes that as a woman, her heart was meant to feel love. Well, after this, Agnès enters and encourages Joan to, quote, be a woman. Could you not be a woman? Feel like one. Take your armor off. The war is done. Confess you are one of the gentler sex. Lay down your arms and take the armor off. Love fears to come too near a heart encased in steel. Oh, be a woman and you will know love. In essence, she prods Joan to cease cross-dressing, to embrace the notions that women are created to love men rather than lead them. As art historian Nora Hyman argues, a central theme of Schiller's work and of the many French imitations that followed, well, a central theme is that, quote, to deny a woman's affectionate nature is to flout natural law and court grief. If a composer or pedagogue wished to reinforce this natural law, to teach girls about this feminine imperative to love rather than act, Agnès represented an ideal role model. Similar themes can be seen in Thibet Bittet's painting, Charles VII and Agnès Sorel, which came out at the 1817 Salon. I can't find the actual painting, but there was a sketch made at the time, so we can get an idea of what this painting looked like. And just like Wilhelm's romance, it depicts Charles's declaration to Agnès that he will leave to drive the English out of France. While his drawn sword demonstrates his newfound courage and determination, his gaze remains fixed on Agnès, and I can maybe even get a little closer here. His gaze remains fixed on Agnès, signaling her essential role in his transformation. 19th century art historian Pierre-Marie Gaud de Saint-Germain wrote of the work in 1817 that, quote, it is Agnès who prepares Charles's action, and one easily discerns in her features the noble sentiments that she showed on that important occasion. Thus, truth unified with moral beauty forces and encourages the public's applause, And this applause intensifies before a national monument, which traces the heart of a beauty giving itself out of love of country and the sensibility of a monarch moved by the cries of the nation and of nature. Critic François Miel likewise noted Bittet's depiction of Agnès' noble sentiments, drawing attention to the humility of her lowered gaze and graceful gesture. Though this ably paints her virtuous character, he nonetheless laments the chaste manner in which Bittet chose to portray Agnès, complaining that the poetry about her actually made her seem far more seductive than the painting does. And here, Miel alludes to Voltaire's infamous mock epic poem, La Pucelle d'Orléans, or the Maid of Orleans, an 18th-century pornographic satire that launched both Agnès and Joan of Arc to international fame. The work was a scandalous success that, though banned and burned across Europe, remained the most widely read text on Agnès Sorel for over a century. It had at least 135 editions by 1860, many with explicit illustrations. Voltaire eroticized Agnès straight away, describing in titillating detail her good looks. Dazzled, enchanted were Charles's ardent eyes that wildly gazed upon the heavenly prize. Who but would worship that like him had pressed a neck in fairest alabaster dressed? Two rising orbs at equal distance placed, heaving and falling by love's pencil traced, each crowned with vermilion blood of damask rose, enchanting bosom which ne'er knew repose. You seemed the gaze and pressure to invite, and wooed the longing lips to seek delight. And he keeps kind of describing further and further down her body until he gets to this section here and decides that he's going to leave it up to the reader's imagination again. But throughout the poem, Voltaire depicts Agnès Sorel in various stages of undress, constantly under the gaze, or worse, of lecherous men. Eventually, she enters into a consensual relationship with an English page boy named Monrose, who soothes injuries she sustained after falling from her horse by rubbing ointment between her thighs. Charles VII later discovers their affair when he finds Monrose naked on a private altar in Agnès' chamber. You can see it, the second one here, you can see Agnès in the bed and Monrose uncovered on the statue's altar, Anyway, so this widely read work served as most French people's introduction to Agnès well into the 19th century. So to transform Agnès from this hypersexualized mistress into a role model, while many of the works created during the Restoration had to resuscitate Agnès' reputation to justify or erase the erotic elements of her relationship with Charles VII. Joseph Delors, for example, argues that Agnès resisted Charles VII as long as possible. When she capitulated, it was because she hoped to inspire him to greatness through her virtue. Quote, Agnès' elevated character protected her from her weaknesses. She was as tender for Charles as she was enthusiastic for the glory of the monarchy. She shares with him the honor of his successes. If love often plays a dishonorable role in the splendor of the French monarchy, one must admit that Agnès' feelings for Charles have always been considered from a different point of view. A successful counselor and no less energetic than the most courageous warrior of the time, one no longer sees anything in the graces of her spirit and in the charm of her person, but the salvation of France and the renown of its king. Defenses of these types became standard. While she was guilty of immoral sexual acts, her virtues, patriotism, and successful efforts to restore the monarchy redeemed her. The romances discussed today contributed to this sanitization of the genre by omitting any overt erotic descriptions of Agnès or of any sexual act between her and Charles VII. They also all fail to mention Charles's wife. In fact, for performers and listeners whose knowledge of history was limited, the relationship between Agnès and the king in the Psalms actually seems moral, rather close to a legitimate marriage. I would like to end by pointing out that my talk has included very little work by women. While composers like Sophie Gale or Pauline Duchamp were among the most celebrated and prolific songwriters of the era, I have not found a single romance about Agnès Sorel written by a woman. Moreover, while it is certainly possible that women performed these songs discussed with sincerity, absorbing lessons about femininity and domestic duty without question, we should not lose sight of the fact that they also had agency, agendas, and perhaps even access to Voltaire's widely circulated writings, which may have undercut the songs' educational and political intentions. While I am treading into the realm of historical conjecture, I also think it's possible that some girls looked to kind of theatrical practices to undermine the songs' sanitized messages of feminine virtue. Like the girls that Sophie Gay lambasted in my introduction who were over the top with their erotic moans, I can imagine some girls employing, well, similar over-the-top expressions or hyperbolic vocal effects, like moans and sighs, to poke fun at what they sang, or even to bring Agnès a little closer to Voltaire's body rendition. And just as Stacey Holman Jones speculates about torch singers like Billie Holiday, imagining such subversive performances allows us to hear, quote, hidden though not silent ironies, indiscretions, and interruptions voiced inside sweet and sleepy melodies. In fact, one of the rare examples of women writing about Agnès Sorel seems to call into question the very idea that women actually had moral power in the home, that something like a romance could truly alter men's behavior or impact history in any way. In their 1841 novel, Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, sisters-in-law Anne-Marie Caroline de Marguerite and Anne-Albe Cornélie de Beaurepaire de Hautefeuille, all these French names, writing jointly under the pseudonym Anne-Marie, they feature a scene in which Agnès sings a romance to Charles VII and a group of courtiers. And her final strophe contains sentiments that should now be familiar. Quote, well, quote, if our king were more victorious, then in my heart he would always be a cherished idol. It's basically the exact same message we've been hearing all along. Their text from the novel was set by a couple of composers, including Louis Jardin. I found this manuscript at the National Library in Paris last summer. And actually, for the sake of time, I think we're going to skip performing the song so I can let you all go on a reasonable time. But we had this one ready to go. Would you like to hear it?
Yeah,
Okay.
you have 10 minutes.
All right. It'll be a very truncated Q&A. All right, well, I'll get us the translations then. Okay. All right, I'll explain how this undercuts more standard themes in a second. But if you scan through the text, I think you'll see this is not so dissimilar from the kinds of songs we've been talking about this entire time. She's clearly kind of nodding to this larger tradition. Okay.
Il est un doux chant qui nous alléchant et mon délitant la conque d'oreille. Va droit par douceur se girer au cœur, mieux que suc de fleur au corps de la veille, mieux que suc de fleur au corps de la veille. D'amour, enjant Dieu court, va voir son bourg, mais à la nuit close. À l'aube, en voix fière, été comme hiver, se revêt de fer, qu'au soir il dépose. Se revêt de fer, qu'au soir il dépose. Donc à jamais gisant hors d'anglais et des rois parfaits éclatant sa mole. Si notre Seigneur sera roi vainqueur et
hypnotic qualities of that comes into the novel's themes a little bit. In any case, in the novel, while Agnès' song earns hearty applause from the courtiers, military leader Jean de Dunois remarks with irony, "They are praying for us here, but it would take many such prayers to return France to its rightful king." Joan of Arc dismisses the romance as a pretty luxury that could only exist away from more meaningful conflict. And while Marie d'Anjou, Charles's wife, lauds Agnès for encouraging sentiments of glory and honor, Agnès' song did not have the desired effect on the king. Quote, "Charles was silent. He seemed to be immersed in a reverie caused more by sounds of the singer's voice than by her song." In other words, while seduced by the beauty of her voice, he remained deaf to her message. Agnès' love and her moral domestic music failed to revive the king's courage, failed to restore his throne. So despite these speculations, complications, and despite Agnès' erotic baggage, many during the Restoration viewed her as the ideal heroine of the moment, particularly in works destined for female consumption in the home. I should have a little image there, yeah. If figures like Joan of Arc received more attention through public monuments, paintings, and theatrical works, and if she now stands as a far more recognizable symbolic figure, Agnès reigned in the salons and in boarding schools. Indeed, I have not found a single romance about Joan of Arc written during the Restoration, suggesting that while she had become an important national symbol, she was certainly not an ideal model of feminine decorum. Composers, writers, artists, and performers commemorated Agnès as both an ideal bourgeois woman and a newly potent national symbol meant to project and solidify several key features of early 19th century French identity, including a penchant for gallantry, royalism, and an ability to rise phoenix-like from the ashes to defend against foreign powers. Thank you. So we have a couple seconds for questions, or I'm happy to stay a little longer than 7:30 if we have the room, but.
We technically have the room, we just have to be out the door
Okay.
before they close at 8 o'clock.
Yeah, they close it. The three pieces, what are the dates of the three pieces?
Yeah, so the first two, the first one was written in 1814, so right at the start of the Restoration. The second was written in 1812, which is why its royalist messages are kind of couched in kind of more critical language.
Yeah.
But it was certainly popular after the Restoration, so it got picked up again. The third one was written in the 1840s.
Yeah, because this one seems very different, like just.
Yeah, you can hear maybe a melodic
Yeah.
change and a harmonic language that's a bit more adventurous.
Yeah.
I brought it up because I think that she's clearly still latching on, or she's kind of making fun of these popular Agnès Sorel songs from the Restoration, right? There's a kind of joke at play here that everyone treats these as very serious, but in fact they really do nothing. That people don't change because they've heard, Agnès sing a song. And it kind of calls into question the whole idea that women stuck in the home have any real power.
Yeah.
I wanted to, going back to the beginning of your talk, where there was the young man kissing the young woman at the piano.
Oh, yeah.
It just, I mean, that goes back as far as Abelard, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this danger of.
So I don't know if there's any, that means anything, but just that presumably there's been a long history of piano teachers kissing young women or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's always, in the 19th century, it really is, the singing instructors would have come to the home. And so I think it's a lot of this is aimed at mothers whose job it is, to protect their daughters from these men from outside coming in and kind of breaking the walls down and bringing potentially bad situations into a supposedly safe environment. And I even in the 18th century, I know a little less about this trope earlier than that, but the 18th century has similar ideas.
It's Dutch Baroque, the 1600s, you see a lot of it playing the harpsichord and so forth, there's a lot of Dutch Baroque.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this kind of like music is a dangerous thing.
Right, yeah.
That there's a seductive quality to music.
Men as a dangerous thing.
Yes.
And it's a
Because
positive.
it didn't work well for Aloysius.
Yeah.
No, it never does.
If you go back to Boccaccio, they weren't singing, they were sitting next to each other reading.
Mhm.
Oh,
Maybe
Well, that's the other thing
romances.
too, is you get
Yeah,
quite
the-
close, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
just the whole thing about,
Yeah.
poetry, emotion, and young men and young women being allowed in proximity to each other with access to those things is inherently dangerous, you know?
Yeah, and in this case, I mean, did you ask if this was Protestant or?
Yeah, I mean, in Italy, you don't find this so much in Catholic. I mean, you do find what Jane says, but not so much.
Oh, I mean, this still would have been Catholic, but I think,
Yeah, but
The
that's
French-
road maintains
Yeah.
are-
oh, yeah. You know, I mean, certainly by this point, you know, especially with Rousseau and Napoleon, I mean, the French have really bought into this idea that women should be in the home. I mean, they're gung-ho about it. And I think all of the pedagogical guides, you know, written for mothers to educate their children, if they talk about music, they always address the potential dangers.
Yeah.
There's a kind of, you know, a real anxiety about this. That is, you know, made fun of a lot in caricatures, but also, I think was a rather real anxiety.
It was an accurate anxiety.
Yeah.
And it probably was,
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
you
Because
know,
things could go badly wrong.
and only for the woman.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wel, voor Abelard, dat also werd procreëren ook.
I guess Abelard didn't come out
Yes,
too
yes.
good either.
He maybe lost more than she did in some ways.
I don't know, economically, what's the status of music teachers?
I mean, the music teachers who go to homes, they're not incredibly wealthy. So they tend to be a bit lower class. You know, if you're doing rather well as a teacher, you'll be working at the conservatoire, or more likely you'll be performing.
I guess the thing is, Rink, is that the guys may not have come out of it too terribly well either.
Oh, because of their social
Yeah,
standing.
yeah.
Well, Abelard was.
It's possible. Yeah, we don't.
Well, I know that, yeah, but I'm saying in this context, these are,
Yeah, there
music
are.
teachers aren't like rich and powerful, they aren't Charles
No, but
VII.
there's still- I mean,
They
there's-
can't get away with having.
It's
mistresses.
possible. There aren't a ton of accounts of them getting their comeuppance afterwards. I think it all. I mean, the guilt always seems to fall
Okay.
on the.
But Chopin and Beethoven and so on always dedicated their sonatas to some
The unknown,
woman who apparently wasn't
immortal beloved, or yeah. Yeah, I mean,
So with reference to the women who maybe are very dramatic and theatrical and exaggerated, I mean, that fits with Voltaire and his like satirical kind of character types and so forth, that they would be, it would be maybe even a humorous kind of thing.
yeah. Well, you know, I think about like teenagers now.
Yeah.
I mean, if they're handed like some derpy song that's supposed to have like a chaste message in it,
Right.
I can't imagine that they would do it without being aware of it and making fun of it. It's like very hard for me to imagine that people were just sucking up all of these conservative ideas.
Yeah.
Or not everybody was a goody two-shoes.
Yeah, you know, some of them probably were. Some probably were really
A lot of them
mindless.
probably weren't.
But teenagers, I don't think change. You know, from century to century.
And Voltaire also had, you know, the learned women he would make fun of.
Well, yeah, the salonière. I mean, Rousseau famously hated
Right.
learned women,
Right.
which is
Except for
Uh-huh.
Emily du Châtelet.
well, yes, but as a group, he hated the salonière.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of his writings in Emile, his pedagogical novel, for example, are kind of directly targeting them.
Yeah.
Well, he targeted a lot.
I mean, he hated all the older French composers. He hated everybody.
He was very funny in how he hated everybody.
Oh, yeah.
But,
Well,
yes.
you know, I always feel very lucky to be studying French topics because all of their writers are incredibly catty. It makes it much more fun than German studies.
Right.
They
It's
take
all very
themselves far too
serious.
seriously, yeah. I've always preferred the French line. Can I yank you back to the 16th century?
Yeah, I can try. Yeah.
So the sort of the turnaround in Agnès's
Yeah.
reputation, and you quoted a work that was from 1576.
Yeah.
Which is smack in the middle of the French Wars of Religion. And probably about the time that Catherine de' Medici was having to rule as regent because her son was off in Poland, slowly making his way back.
And actually, yeah, Catherine de' Medici comes into this in a big way.
Okay.
And actually, Agnès has a little resurgence right at the start of the 16th century when, Francis I's regent, Yolande, his mother.
Okay.
She also kind of looks at Agnès Sorel as a model mistress, or she tries to position her as such, because Francis I has a really kind of uppity mistress rolling around who's starting to challenge his mother's power. And so she actually commissioned a portrait to be kind of put into a collection of, Francis I's kind of collection of beautiful women to try and get him interested in Agnès Sorel and this kind of story. But yeah, going to the wars of religion, I think the idea was the same for Catherine, that she was looking for.
She was wielding power she should not have.
Yeah. And I mean, her whole reputation, well, no one's better than me, but I mean, it had to be built on a kind of virginal, on virginal symbolic symbols. I mean, I think it was, I can't remember which goddess she aligns herself with most, but, so she, I think at the same time, there were also mistresses floating around with her sons that were causing some problems. And so she latched onto the same person that the old regent had latched onto, and kind of pushes the historian to write this really glowing story about Agnès Sorel. Because actually he had written a previous work that had Agnès Sorel in it, and he was very critical. And so it's not until he becomes royal historian that his tune changes a bit. And we don't know if Catherine de' Medici pushed for it, but it's likely that she
Really?
kind of insisted that she get a better write-up.
So that was the backlash to Charles IX's mistress?
Probably.
Or to the fact that Henry III?
I think it was more Charles IX. I think it had more to do with her sons. I guess Henry III is also, I forget how many sons she had.
Yeah.
She had like 3 sons that died while she was,
Yes, but Henry III was the one that, like, mistresses would not have been the problem.
oh, yes, okay. I don't think that was, I think it was more,
Charles IX makes no sense in that context, yeah.
yeah, so.
Anyway, thank you for.
No, sorry, I'm trying to brush up on my, or like remember back to my Catherine de'
You
Medici.
have me brushing up on my Voltaire, so fair enough.
In the one image, it was a drawing.
Yes, is that the painting, or the drawing of the
The
painting?
drawing of the painting. And that reminds me of a Rubens painting, which is Marie de' Medici when Henry IV is like guided by this woman who's the allegory of France, who whispers into his ear that he should marry Marie de' Medici, and he,
Yeah, this is part of that huge collection of Marie de' Medici paintings.
Yeah, and all those by
Yeah.
Rubens, and so it seems like visually the idea is similar, that she's sort of like this advisor, kind of,
Yeah.
this, like
Yeah.
Mother France.
And I think, they certainly would have been aware of those paintings.
Yeah.
This actually plays probably far more into what they call the genre troubadour, the troubadour genre. This real obsession with troubadour culture. But I think they still would have, they have a really big idea of what troubadour means,
Yeah.
and a very big idea of what the Middle Ages were.
Right, yeah.
So probably,
Yeah, the pre-Raphaelites are all, in England, the same kind of situation, mid-1800s. But they would have known those
The
Rubens
Fouquet
paintings.
painting of Agnès Sorel as the Virgin with the bare breast, that's her image.
yeah.
And there is another painting of her
That's not.
in the bath with.
Yes, where the king sees her from.
No, and she's, these were contemporary paintings.
Yeah.
She was a scandalous figure,
Well,
but
but there
she
was
didn't live very long.
no. She died probably around 25 years old, having had 3 children.
Yeah, and there was a fourth, she died in,
Yeah, she had a fourth. She had a miscarriage.
yeah. What the Encyclopedia Britannica says that she encouraged Charles to listen to his advisors as well as to go to war, and to listen to Joan of Arc, who was willing to.
Well, and this is where the story gets a little off, because it's really unlikely. She would have been about 5 years old when Joan of Arc died.
Really?
Yeah. So actually, it's later histories that tend to pair them together because they are like perfect foils for each other. It's really symbolic more than it is like true. But it's a mistake that a lot of histories make. But the reality is that Agnès didn't make it to court until 1444, and Joan of Arc died in 1431. So it was, quite a bit later.
Yeah.
And actually, the other thing is the 100 Years' War was basically won like France was already very much at the end of this war, and the English were kind of nudged all the way back to Calais. And so she really didn't actually do very much in this war because there wasn't much to do. So it's really these 16th century writers who give her this story about inspiring Charles to go do all this stuff. Because in reality, I mean, we have some hints that she maybe was politicking, but actually some historians now are thinking that she was far less active in politics than later mistresses, because she would have been ripped apart even more by chroniclers if she had been really active in court.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's you know, she's one of these, you know, medieval women who really has achieved a kind of celebrity status. And even encyclopedia entries are just full of kind of half-truths or, you know, even the idea, I think there's a common story that she was the first official mistress, like she had a title, which is simply not true. There was no title. Sometimes she was called the maîtresse en titre, which basically just means the latest mistress. The current mistress, yeah.
Yeah, the current official one, as opposed to all the other women.
You know, the ones that he had
who are
already dropped, yeah, the ones who died in, you know,
not. Or the ones who were
childbirth
just
or-
hookups.
And later on, they did have those official titles.
Well, so they start to, but they I think most people are reading her history through these later
Right, so they're
mistresses.
Like Madame de Poulin.
Yeah, Pompadour is the big one, or Gabrielle de Pavon, yeah.
But it's interesting, because there would have been more women like her, so why then did they pick her as opposed to, you know?
You know, I think part of it was that lack of politicking, because her cousin actually took up with the king after she died. And apparently she was rather more active in court.
Mhm.
And so her reputation suffered far more when she died, you know, compared to Agnès. But they also say that it was probably her family that really campaigned to resuscitate her image.
Yeah.
The king had recognized all three daughters by Agnès Sorel and actually secured them quite good marriages.
Mhm.
And they had a number of really good holdings because of the gifts that she'd been given.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so the family are the ones who probably commissioned a lot of these, you know, images of Agnès Sorel as the Virgin Mary, you know, trying to kind of, yeah, rehabilitate her a bit. And I think there was just enough of that floating around the air that people in the 16th century could really latch onto it and run with it.
That makes sense. I mean, that's the way to get her family,
Yeah, well, to keep them
yeah.
somewhat respectable, you know, she's different than those other mistresses. All right. Did you have a question? Oh, okay, sorry, look at you were. Okay.
I have a question about the guitar though.
Oh, yeah.
Where did you get, is the 19th century guitar?
Yeah, so I actually found it at a porn trader in downtown Oklahoma City.
Oh, really?
They
Wow.
just had it hanging up. It had gone through some repairs, but yeah, it was just hanging on the wall, and it's doesn't have a label on it or anything, but just from the construction of it, it's about from, you know, kind of the middle of the 19th century, maybe 40s, 50s, 40s or 50s. So it was a good find, you know, worked out that we kind of.
Yeah.
And also, you know, it's interesting, it has ivory frets.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah, really lovely, quite a bit more subdued than the modern.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're quite a bit smaller, you know, they're like, compared to the modern classical guitar, pretty thick, they're not
Yeah.
that, much shorter scale, so they're better for smaller hands.
And actually the guitar was associated with women more than men at the start of the 19th century. It was seen as a very feminine instrument.
Yeah.
All right, well with that, should we start moving chairs or?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Chairs and stuff.
I brought this in case anyone wanted